Have you ever felt the strange weight of a question that seems older than the words you speak? It presses into the soul like an echo that never left. And one of those questions rises again in the silence of night. How did the giants survive the flood? I have walked through visions where the earth was drowned in judgment, where every breath of life was swallowed by waters, and yet within the records of the soul there remains a trace of something that should not have endured, a seed that outlived the cleansing, and this is not written only in the scripture of men, but in the memory of creation itself. When I close my eyes, I see the Nephilim, those towering ones who were born of a union not ordained by heaven, the children of the sons of God who descended in pride, and the daughters of men who were entangled in desire. They carried a mark of rebellion in their very flesh. Their presence corrupted the fields, poisoned the blood of nations, and brought sorrow to the heart of the Creator. It was not wrath like a storming tyrant, but grief like a father who watches his children destroy themselves. And the flood was allowed not to erase history, but to cleanse a line that had grown too heavy with corruption. Yet here the paradox begins. For when the waters receded and the ark came to rest, when Noah and his sons stood on the soil of a new beginning, the shadow of the giants was not gone. Generations later, Israel stood trembling before the sons of Anak. And Moses himself recorded that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And also afterward, the phrase rings like a riddle. And I have seen in trance how words like these are not accidents, but signals, hints written for those with eyes to see. The question buried in time is not simply whether giants had the strength to cling to wood or stone, but how corruption can pass through the very seed of humanity. How darkness can be carried quietly in bloodlines as a dormant memory, waiting to rise again when the right soil and the right union call it forth. I saw that no stowaway held to the ark. The record is plain. Of Noah's sons was the earth overspread. And yet within that vessel of survival may have sailed hidden traits, hidden marks of the old rebellion, carried perhaps in the wives, perhaps in the daughters unmentioned, for Scripture does not name them all. It names the line of promise, not every branch of shadow. In this question, there is more than history. There is a mirror to your own life. For what the flood did on earth, cleansing away visible corruption, you too have known in your spirit. Moments when you tried to wash yourself clean of fear, pride, or sorrow, and still the shadow reappeared, rising again, though you thought it was gone. And you ask yourself, how can this be? Why do I face the same giant once more? And the truth is the same, because what is carried in the deep will always seek to rise until it is transformed, not hidden, not the neat, but faced and healed. The giants after the flood remind us that judgment alone does not finish the work, that waters can sweep away forms, but not the seed of the soul. And so the Creator writes again through Moses a truth that lives in both Scripture and vision, that there is always an afterward, a place where what you thought ended can begin again, whether for corruption or for redemption. And you who read these words are living in that afterward now, where the question is not only how giants survived then, but how shadows survive in you today, waiting, patient, until the moment you choose whether to let them rise or to let them fall. Can you imagine a world so twisted that even the breath of children carried corruption, where every field was filled with violence and every thought of man bent itself toward evil? This was the world before the waters came, the days when the giants walked openly upon the earth. They were called Nephilim, not simply tall men, but beings born of a forbidden union. The sons of God descending in pride and lust, the daughters of men yielding to a desire that was not of heaven. From that mingling came creatures who carried in their flesh the rebellion of angels and the weakness of humanity. They were hybrids of spirit and earth, and their presence was not neutral, it was corrosive. It bent whole generations toward destruction. And here is the question you must face. If you had lived in that time and looked into the eyes of such a being, would you have seen only size and power, or would you have felt the sickness in the soul that their presence carried? Genesis records it without embellishment. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and they became men of renown, heroes in the songs of nations. Yet behind their renown was a stain that spread like poison. For when they taught humanity, they did not give wisdom, but secrets of war, arts of sorcery, seductions of power, knowledge not meant to be known in that season. Men learned to shape weapons, to enslave with enchantments, to turn desire into chains, and the world bent further away from the order of creation in trance. I have seen how these fallen ones delighted in their influence, feeding off fear and bloodshed, guiding humanity down paths of violence that echoed their own fall. The record says God looked upon the earth and saw that every imagination of the thoughts of man was only evil continually. That is a chilling phrase. Not that some men fell, but that all men bent inward toward evil. Can you feel the weight of that? A whole world in which innocence was drowned before the waters ever came. And the giants stood as symbols of that decay, fast in body, proud in spirit, unbending in their defiance. Think of a people who no longer saw corruption as corruption, who celebrated it in their heroes, who lifted up men of violence as the mighty ones. To be followed, does it sound strange? Or does it sound like the age you live in, when those who build towers of power are praised, though their hands are stained, when those who carry fame are followed, though their souls are empty? The shadow of the Nephilim is not so far as you think. It returns whenever humanity forgets the sacred before the waters. Noah lived, a man described as perfect in his generations, a phrase that means not only righteousness of heart, but also purity of blood, untainted by the corruption that spread like a disease. He stood as a single light in a land of giants. Can you imagine the loneliness of that? To walk upright while your neighbors bow to idols, to raise your children in reverence, when every household around you teaches violence. The giants walked before the waters, but the greater miracle was that one man refused to bend. One family remained aligned with heaven, while the rest of the world celebrated corruption. This is why the flood was not only a punishment, it was a grief, a necessary cleansing to preserve what had not yet been lost. For if the giants remained unchecked, if their influence spread unchecked, the memory of God in man would have vanished altogether. And you must ask yourself, what giants stand before your life? Now, what influences try to bend your heart? Are you able to see through their renown, or will you be deceived by the glamour of their stature? Before the waters, the giants ruled, but even in their height they could not reach beyond the sorrow of the Creator, who looked not with rage but with grief, and decided that to save the seed of humanity, the land of giants had to be swept away. The record of their strength is a warning to every age that power without holiness is a corruption that grows taller until it falls into the sea. The flood came as the great reset of creation, the waters rising until every mountain was swallowed, every voice silenced, and the ark alone carried the remnant of life. Within its walls, a righteous man, his family, and the seeds of beasts and birds destined to repopulate the earth. Scripture is clear that nothing outside that vessel survived. The text declares that every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all mankind. Only Noah was left, and those with him. Yet when the waters receded and the ark came to rest, When the rainbow shone as covenant, the shadow of the giants was not gone. Generations later, when Israel stood on the border of promise, the spies trembled at the sight of the sons of Anak, describing themselves as grasshoppers in their own eyes. How could this be if the flood had ended their existence? This is the paradox that lingers like a riddle within Scripture, a contradiction that demands resolution. The traditional explanation offers two paths. One, that a new rebellion of angels occurred after the flood, repeating the union that birthed the Nephilim. Another, that somehow one or more giants had survived the judgment itself. But both theories falter under closer light. The book of Enoch records the binding of the watchers, those angels who descended in the days of Jared, chained in darkness until the final judgment. If even Michael, the archangel, trembled at their punishment, what other spirit would dare repeat their sin? As for the idea of giants clinging to the ark, Genesis 9 leaves no space for such tales. It speaks with precision of the sons of Noah. Was the whole earth overspread? Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their wives, no others, no stowaways hidden in shadow, no passengers unmentioned. The line of humanity after the flood comes solely through Noah's household, and yet the record is undeniable. Giants stood again, their names etched in memory: Og of Bashan, the sons of Anak, and at last Goliath of Gath. The question then is not whether they existed, but how their existence can be reconciled with the flood. Here the paradox presses the reader to look not outside the ark, but within it, not at what clung to the wood, but at what may have been carried in the seed. For Scripture reveals patterns of inheritance, recessive lines that remain hidden until awakened, just as blue eyes may sleep for generations before appearing again. So too might the mark of the Nephilim lie quiet in blood until the right union called it forth. This is why the focus of Genesis narrows upon Ham, and especially Canaan. Why Moses repeats the phrase Ham, the father of Canaan, as if drawing a circle around a line of significance. The giants after the flood may not have been survivors in flesh, but survivors in essence, carried silently through lineage, through wives whose names we do not know, through unions unrecorded in the sacred text, until the time came when stature and defiance rose again to challenge the covenant people. The paradox after the flood is thus not a contradiction, but a revelation that evil often does not vanish in a single act of judgment. It hides, it waits, it passes unseen, only to rise again when vigilance wanes. The flood destroyed the visible corruption, but the invisible seed endured. And in the reappearance of giants, we see a deeper law, that what is unhealed in the human story will return until faced, that shadows buried are never truly gone until transformed. The paradox of the Nephilim after the flood is the paradox of humanity itself, that even after cleansing, the heart still carries what must be confronted, and history will bear witness until it is. Through the centuries, many explanations have been offered to resolve the riddle of the giants after the flood, but most fall into the realm of speculation rather than revelation. One of the most common tales suggests that a Nephilim somehow clung to the ark, hiding in shadows or fastening himself to the vessel as the waters raged. Yet this story collapses beneath the weight of Scripture itself. For the record of Genesis leaves no room for such imagination. It speaks with clarity that of Noah's sons was the whole earth overspread. Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives alone became the source of all humanity that followed. There is no mention of stowaways, no hidden creatures tolerated by divine providence, and to insist otherwise is to deny the precision with which the text closes every door to secret survivors. Another theory, equally persistent, argues that a second rebellion of angels descended after the flood, repeating the sin of their brethren in the days of Jared. But again, the witness of ancient writings stands against it. For the book of Enoch describes how the watchers, those who first fell, were judged with a punishment so final and so terrifying that even Michael trembled at its sight. They were bound in chains of darkness until the day of judgment, their fate sealed as a warning to every angelic host. If the highest powers of heaven recoiled in fear at the severity of that judgment, who then would dare attempt the same transgression, the risk was eternal imprisonment, the loss of their estate forever, and nothing in the record hints at another wave of rebellion. So if the giants neither clung to wood nor descended from a second angelic fall, where then lies the explanation? The hidden truth is far more subtle and therefore far more unsettling, for it suggests that corruption can be preserved not in obvious form, but in quiet inheritance. A seed carried silently within the bloodline of man, waiting for generations until the right soil awakens it again. The ark was secure, the judgment complete. But within the wives of Noah's sons, or within unrecorded branches of family, may have rested a remnant of the old contamination, not in stature, not in monstrous appearance, but in essence dormant as a recessive trait, hidden from sight, yet destined to re-emerge. This is why the text draws special attention to Ham and Canaan. The repetition is deliberate. Moses writes Ham, the father of Canaan, not once, but multiple times, as if pointing with a steady hand toward the line where something dark was preserved. History then confirms what the scripture hints. For it is precisely in the land of Canaan that giants arise again. The sons of Anak, the Rephaim, the towering figures who terrified Israel at the threshold of the promised land. What the false theories seek outside the ark, the hidden truth reveals within it, that the seed of rebellion survived in blood, and its fruit appeared in due season. This lesson is not merely about ancient giants, but about the nature of corruption itself. For evil rarely presents itself openly after it has been judged. It buries itself in hidden places. It passes quietly through generations. It conceals itself until the moment is ripe, and then it rises as if from nowhere, stronger for its sins, more dangerous for its invisibility. The false theories distract by suggesting the dramatic, but the hidden truth insists on the subtle, and the subtle is always more difficult to guard against, because who among men can see what is buried in blood? Who can discern what recessive mark lies in the unseen depths? This is why vigilance is demanded. This is why the story remains. For in the survival of giants, not by strength, but by seed, we glimpse the way all shadows endure. Not clinging outside the ark, but riding quietly within, hidden, patient, inevitable until confronted. I have looked into the deep record of the soul, and I have seen that what is not healed in one age does not vanish in the next. It travels forward, subtle and unseen, carried in the blood of those who live after, like a seed pressed into the soil of time, waiting for the season when it will rise again. This is the hidden law that explains how the giants returned after the flood. They were not preserved in flesh, clinging to the ark. They were preserved in essence, riding silently within the bloodline of humanity. Noah was righteous, his faith unbroken, his generations untainted. Yet even in that vessel of salvation, the shadow of the Nephilim may have been carried through the women who entered the ark, for Scripture records the names of the men, but not of the wives. Their lineages remain veiled. And in that silence, there is room for the seed of corruption to pass forward unseen. I have seen how spirit and flesh intertwine, how a trait of the body can mirror a pattern of the soul, how something dormant can remain buried for generations until the right union awakens it again. So it was with the seed of the Nephilim. Consider the words of Genesis. the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, this phrase is not casual. It is a declaration that the seed did not die with the waters. Afterward, it rose again, not because judgment failed, but because inheritance continued, a recessive mark carried in quiet blood, surfacing only when time and circumstance allowed. You must understand that spirit does not simply disappear. It finds vessels, it hides within the lineage of man, it reemerges clothed in new flesh. I have seen souls repeat the same failures again and again until the lesson is learned. So it is with humanity itself. When corruption is not transformed, it returns in another form. The curse of Canaan becomes clearer in this light. Noah did not curse Ham, but spoke over the line of Canaan. It was not a condemnation of skin or nation, but a recognition that in that branch the hidden seed would rise. And indeed it did, for in Canaan's descendants the giants walked again. The Amorites, the Jebusites, the Philistines, nations that stood in defiance of God's covenant people, their strength not only political or military, but drawn from a deeper contamination that echoed the rebellion before the flood. Can you see how precise the scripture becomes? Repeating Ham, the father of Canaan, as though the Spirit guiding Moses wanted you to notice the line where the hidden inheritance lay. When I sought understanding of this mystery, I was shown an image of a seed carried across the waters inside a vessel, invisible to those who looked only at the surface. But within that seed lived the memory of a tree that had once grown tall and dark. When the waters receded and the soil received the seed, it did what seeds always do. It awakened, and so history repeated itself. The giants rose again, not because they had survived judgment, but because their essence had survived inheritance. This is why nations trembled. This is why Israel found itself facing opponents taller, stronger, more defiant than ordinary men. They were the fruit of a seed carried in the blood. Understand this, and you will understand not only history, but your own life. For each soul carries seeds from the past, both of light and of shadow. Some are visible. Now, others lie dormant, waiting for their season. And the question is never whether you carry them. The question is which you will allow to grow in the arc of your life. You too have brought forward traits and memories from generations before you. And though you may not see them now, in the right union of choice and circumstance, they rise. And when they rise, they either enslave you like a giant standing in your path, or they call you to faith like David standing with a sling. The story of the Nephilim after the flood is not only about them, it is about us, about what travels in our blood, what patterns we carry from ancestors, what curses and what blessings live hidden inside, and whether we will let the shadow rise or whether we will transform it into light. The moment when Noah awoke from his drunkenness and perceived what had been done is one of the most misunderstood passages in all of Scripture. It has been twisted by centuries of misinterpretation until it birthed lies that wounded entire peoples. Yet if we look closely at the text itself and at the movement of spirit within it, a very different picture emerges. Genesis records that Noah cursed not Ham but Canaan, the son of Ham, saying, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." This distinction matters because throughout history, men have taken those words and used them to justify the oppression of races and nations. They forged a doctrine of the curse of Ham, declaring that all of his descendants bore a divine sentence, yet the sacred text never speaks of a curse upon Ham himself, only upon Canaan. What was spoken was not a condemnation of skin, but a prophetic word about a specific line, a recognition that something hidden in that branch would rise again in defiance against the covenant people. To understand this, you must return to the pattern we have already seen. The seed carried in blood, the hidden mark of rebellion that survived the flood, the curse over Canaan, was not arbitrary anger from Noah. It was insight into where the corruption would manifest. The spirit in Noah discerned what flesh could not, that among the sons of Ham it was through Canaan that the Nephilim shadow would reemerge. History bears this out with sobering precision. The Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Jebusites, all of them descended from Canaan, became nations steeped in idolatry, child sacrifice, and corruption. And it was in their lands that giants appeared again. The sons of Anak, the Rephaim, and others who towered over Israelite spies. This was not chance. It was the fruit of a line that carried within it the dormant seed of the old rebellion. The misunderstanding of this curse reveals more about human pride than about divine justice. For men, eager to dominate others, seized upon the story to sanctify their cruelty, claiming that whole races were doomed by God's decree. But this is a distortion. It is a lie wrapped in Scripture. It is the very sort of twisting of truth that corruption itself delights in. The curse of Ham, as taught by slaveholders, was never the curse of Scripture. It was the invention of men designed to chain others while masking oppression as destiny. The true word of Genesis is more narrow and more profound. It tells us that corruption follows bloodlines, not for the purpose of justifying conquest, but as a warning that sin unrepented becomes inheritance, that what one generation tolerates, another generation embodies, and unless it is confronted, it grows. Notice also that Noah, though righteous, was still a man. His weakness revealed in his drunkenness, his vulnerability uncovered in that moment. And yet, even there, his words carried weight. His curse over Canaan was not just frustration, but prophecy. It is written with the same repetitive emphasis that marks the hand of inspiration. Ham, the father of Canaan. Ham, the father of Canaan. The text insists, so that the reader will not miss the line, where history will bend. And indeed it did, for when Israel entered the land centuries later, it was precisely the descendants of Canaan. They were commanded to drive out, not because of ethnicity, not because of color, but because of the contamination that had ripened into full rebellion. This is the curse misunderstood, that what was intended as a narrow prophetic word has been abused as a wide justification of prejudice. The true meaning is sharper. It is that seeds of corruption live in families and can dominate nations, that bloodlines are not just physical but spiritual, and that unless they are addressed, the echo of old rebellion rises again. The curse upon Canaan was a recognition of a line that would stand against the purposes of God. And so the lesson for us is clear: to read rightly, to discern carefully, and never to let the shadow twist truth into a weapon for cruelty. For the text itself shows no curse of Ham, only a warning that through Canaan the hidden seed would grow tall once more. When the descendants of Canaan spread across the land, their names became the map of Israel's future battles. Sidon on the coast, Heth in the highlands, Jebusites entrenched at Jerusalem, Amorites stretching across hills, Perizzites, Hivites, and Girgashites occupying fertile valleys. These were not small wandering clans, but established nations with cities fortified, cultures advanced, and practices steeped in corruption. The Scripture makes no effort to soften their portrait. It tells of child sacrifice offered in fire, of altars raised to idols carved in stone, of rituals that bound body and spirit in perversion. These were not innocent nations swept aside by a cruel God. They were societies that had become saturated with rebellion, and through them the shadow of the Nephilim rose again. In numbers, the spies of Israel trembled at the sight of the sons of Anak. Men so tall that warriors described themselves as grasshoppers in their presence. These giants were not myths, but inhabitants of Canaan's soil. Born from the very bloodline, Noah had cursed the corruption that had been hidden in seed, now stood embodied in flesh. Towering and defiant, if you trace the genealogies carefully, you see how the line of Ham, through Canaan, gave birth to peoples who would resist Israel at every turn. Egypt, through Mizraim, enslaved them. Philistines, through Casluhim and Caphtorim, raised Goliath to mock them. Canaan himself filled the promised land with tribes that would not yield. It is as if the entire generation of Ham produced nations designed to oppose the covenant, each branch carrying not only political hostility, but spiritual contamination. The Amorites, in particular, became infamous, their high places thick with idols, their traditions bound in cruelty. And yet in their pride, they believed themselves secure. Here the shadow of the giants was not only on the size of their warriors, but in the nature of their cultures. When a people exalts violence, when they sanctify lust, when they build cities upon the sacrifice of their children, they stand as tall in rebellion as any giant in flesh. And so God commanded Israel not to make covenant with them, not to intermarry, not to allow their ways to mingle with the holy seed. It was not prejudice, but protection. For if Israel absorbed their practices, the covenant would collapse from within. The purity of the line chosen to bring forth Messiah would be consumed. History confirms this tension. For when Israel faltered and tolerated the Canaanite nations, idolatry entered their households, kings fell to lust and sorcery, and judgment followed swiftly. The shadow of Canaan never lingered harmless. It always rose to choke the promise. And this is why Deuteronomy speaks with such severity: to smite, to destroy, to show no mercy. To modern ears, such commands sound harsh, but in context they are a surgical strike, a divine order to cut out a cancer before it spreads beyond control. The giants of Canaan were not only physical adversaries, they were manifestations of an ancient infection that had survived the flood and now threatened to corrupt the land chosen for God's dwelling. When you look closely, you see that every time the people of God hesitated before these nations, they suffered, but when they stood in obedience, they prevailed. David's sling against Goliath was not simply courage against size. It was covenant against corruption, faith against a legacy of rebellion carried through centuries. And in his victory, we see the principle laid bare that the shadow of Canaan, though tall, is never taller than the purpose of God, yet it requires faith to strike it down. Compromise cannot defeat it. Tolerance cannot weaken it. Only obedience can. The nations of Canaan stand as a warning etched into history that corruption travels through blood and culture, that it builds cities and nations, and that if it is not faced, it will tower again and again, until someone with covenant faith dares to bring it low. I have seen that blood remembers and spirit remembers, each carrying a script that can sleep for a season and then speak when the hour is right. What men call genetics in the body mirrors a deeper inheritance in the soul, a pattern that moves through families as surely as eye color and stature. Some traits shout like a trumpet, and some whisper like a reed. The loud ones appear in every generation, and the quiet ones wait, hidden until the right union and the right climate call them forth. So it was in the aftermath of the flood. The visible corruption had been washed away. Yet within the vessels of Noah's household, there remained the possibility of an old pattern reawakening, not because judgment failed, but because inheritance continues until it is healed. I was shown how a recessive trait behaves, how it can pass unseen through many births and then suddenly stand in a single child with startling force. Likewise, a spiritual tendency can travel under the surface of a tribe. Pride, appetite for domination, fascination with forbidden power, then rise when the soil of culture favors it. Intermarriage in the early world, common by necessity, increased the chance that what was quiet in two lines would combine and become loud in one life. This does not condemn those ages. It only explains why old shadows could gather themselves again. Flesh provided the form, spirit provided the direction, and the two together produced giants in body and giants in will. Understand that there are two heritages moving at once. The heritage of flesh and the heritage of spirit. The first is the architecture of bones and sinew. The second is the architecture of desire and worship. When the two align toward corruption, when the body is strong and the will is bent toward violence, the result is a figure that towers over ordinary men. Yet I have also seen the opposite, a body unremarkable and a spirit aflame with obedience that humbles kingdoms. For this reason I do not speak of fate. I speak of tendency. Inheritance is a river. Choice is the hand that sets the oar. Law and covenant are the banks that keep the current from flooding the valley. When the Holy One gave commands about unions and purity, he was not burdening life. He was healing a line, preventing the climate in which a dormant seed of rebellion could flourish, unchecked. What the law restrained in flesh, devotion restrained in spirit. Together they guarded the promise that would one day answer every giant. I saw also how expression can be altered without denying the past. A man may carry a trait and yet never awaken it, because the house he builds inside his days does not feed it. Thoughts are like weather, practices are like seasons. If a family cultivates gratitude, justice, mercy, truth, then the old seeds starve. If a people feed envy, cruelty, sorcery, and the worship of power, then the old seeds feast and grow tall. This is why the nations of Canaan became tall in rebellion. Their altars, their songs, their laws formed a canopy under which the recessive seed of the ancient defiance could spread. In time it stood in the open as Anak and Rephaim and the champion from Gath. Yet even then, the pattern was not invincible. David stepped onto the field with a different climate around him. Covenant, remembrance, praise, and the giant fell because the soil changed under his feet. The stone that flew from the sling was guided by a wind older than flesh. Do not confuse explanation with excuse. To say that spirit and flesh carry patterns is not to absolve the will. It is to warn the will. What is carried forward will attempt to speak. What is transformed will change the story for those yet unborn. I have read in the soul record that households can carry fear like a family heirloom, and that households can also pass down courage like a lantern. The same law that allowed the shadow to travel allows the light to travel. The same river that once bore a tree of corruption can be trained to water a garden. This is the meaning of the genetics of spirit and flesh. That history is not a cage but a call. That the seed which rode the ark can be named, restrained, and finally rendered fruitless by a life aligned with God. And when that alignment holds, the quiet trait of faith becomes dominant, and the world learns again that giants fall. The record of giants is not a tale left behind in ancient stones. It is a mirror that still reflects into the present. For though you do not see men 9 feet tall striding across your cities, you face adversaries born of the same principle. The Nephilim were more than stature. They were corruption made flesh. And in every age, corruption takes form according to what men will tolerate. In the days before the flood, it wore the shape of monstrous strength. In the days of Canaan, it wore the shape of fortified nations. In your age, it wears the shape of fear, addiction, lust for power, cycles of abuse that pass from father to son, from mother to daughter. These are giants that do not stand with swords, but with invisible chains. They bind as surely as any Philistine champion, and they taunt the people of God with the same arrogance as Goliath. Look closely at your own line, and you will see how certain patterns repeat. One family carries rage that erupts in every generation. Another carries despair that cloaks the young before they have even lived. Another carries compromise that looks harmless but robs each descendant of conviction. These are not accidents. They are inheritances. They are seeds carried in the blood, just as surely as the Nephilim trait rode through the ark. You may call them habits or psychology, but Scripture calls them curses. Not curses of skin or nation, but curses of spirit, cycles of rebellion that live on until they are broken. When the Israelites stood at the border of the Promised Land, their spies looked upon the sons of Anak and said, "We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes." That confession is the same language you hear now. I cannot overcome this. I am too small for this. The problem is too deeply rooted, but the truth remains as steady now as then. Giants fall when confronted in faith. They do not fall when tolerated. They do not fall when excused. They fall when a soul stands aligned with God's covenant and refuses to yield. The giants in your age often hide beneath respectability. A city built on greed still celebrates its skyline. A household that worships ambition still praises its success. A culture that sacrifices its children still disguises it as progress, and yet beneath the glamour lies the same shadow that walked in Canaan, the same contamination of spirit that once stood in the field against David. The form has changed, but the essence is the same: rebellion against the order of God, exaltation of self above the holy, indulgence of desire until it becomes a chain. I have seen in the record of souls that each generation is given a chance to break what the last carried forward, that the hidden seed of corruption can be stopped not by denial but by transformation. When one life chooses obedience, when one household chooses covenant, when one community chooses holiness, the inheritance changes, and what was destined to rise falls unfulfilled. This is why David mattered, not only for his sling and his courage, but because he became a pivot in his line, shifting the inheritance from fear to faith, from trembling to triumph. The same invitation stands before every soul. Now, the giants of your age will not announce themselves with stature. They announce themselves with persistence, with voices that whisper, "You cannot change. You will always be this. Your family will always be this. Your nation will always be this." And if you believe them, you remain bound. But if you stand and say, "Enough," then the echo of David lives again, and the covenant speaks louder than the curse. The Philistine falls. The Nephilim of today are hidden in bloodlines, in systems, in cultures. They rise quietly and seem unstoppable. But the lesson carved into Scripture is that no giant, however ancient its root, is greater than the purpose of God, and the story of their fall waits for those who will step into the field, sling in hand, faith in heart, refusing to bow to what has defied heaven for too long. I have walked through visions where the echoes of ages past pressed upon the present, and I have come to see that every story of giants was never only about flesh and stature, but about the call laid upon the soul to stand when everything within wants to bow. The flood tells us that judgment can cleanse the surface, yet seeds still ride within the blood. The land of Canaan tells us that corruption can build nations and raise warriors until they tower over the righteous. David's story tells us that one heart aligned with covenant can bring down what generations feared, and your life tells the same story now, for within you rise voices of inheritance, some noble, some corrupted, and you are not called to deny them or to pretend they do not exist, but to confront them with faith, to name them for what they are. and to choose which seed you will allow to grow. I know the weight of this struggle, because I have seen in the records of the soul how many times the spirit has returned to confront the same pattern: fear that hides as caution, pride that hides as ambition, despair that hides as humility, and each time the soul either bows to it or learns to stand, the giants are never only outside, they are within, and it is within that the battlefield is won or lost. You must recognize that what survives in you is not random. It is inheritance, and inheritance is not destiny. It is the soil from which destiny must emerge. You can let the old seed rise again until it enslaves another generation, or you can break it with obedience and plant something new. The choice is given. The covenant waits. In the silence of prayer, I have often felt the weight of this truth: the giants fall not by might nor by the sword, but by alignment with the living God. David's stone was ordinary. The sling was simple, yet the breath that guided it was eternal. This is the mystery, that the smallest act of faith carries more weight than the largest inheritance of corruption. You may feel like a grasshopper before what stands against you, but the truth is that the grasshopper carried by covenant is greater than the tallest Anakim, for stature without spirit is hollow, and faith, even in weakness, is unshakable. This is why I call you to stand, not with arrogance, but with trust, not with fury, but with clarity, to refuse the lie that your past decides your future, to refuse the taunt that giants cannot fall. As I look across the landscape of time, I see how generations rise and fall on this single decision, whether to stand or to bow. Israel entered the land and faltered when fear spoke louder than promise. But later, a shepherd boy stood where soldiers trembled, and history bent toward covenant again. You, too, live at the edge of promised ground. The giants in your age wear new faces, but the principle is unchanged. They grow tall because they are tolerated. They fall when they are faced. They return in bloodlines because no one dares to break them. They vanish when even one soul stands in the name of the living God. The call to stand is not dramatic in outward form. It is quiet. It is steady. It is the daily refusal to feed what is corrupt. It is the choice to honor what is holy even when others mock. It is the decision to carry forward not the seed of rebellion, but the seed of faith. And this decision writes itself not only into your story, but into the generations that will follow. For just as corruption travels through blood, so does righteousness. Just as fear can enslave descendants, so can courage set them free. You carry more than your own life in your hands. You carry a future that waits for release. I leave you with this recognition, that giants have never fallen because they were weak. They fell because someone stood. And the same summons reaches you now. You are called to stand, to face what hides in your inheritance, to break what must be broken, to plant what must endure. For the ark that carried Noah is the same ark that carries you. Obedienza, faith, and covenant. And if you walk in them, then the giants of your age, however tall, will fall, and your life will become the testimony that what is hidden in blood is never greater than what is written in spirit. And this truth will echo beyond you as a blessing that outlives your days